Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey into the harsh realities of medieval masculinity. While Hollywood paints pictures of valiant knights and noble lords living lives of honor and glory, the truth is far more grim. If you were born a man in medieval times, chances are your life would be defined by brutality, disease, and an early grave. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're born in the year 1250, somewhere in rural England. The moment you take your first breath, the odds are already stacked against you in ways that would make modern survival shows look like luxury vacations. You're not entering a world of chivalry and romance. You're entering a world where being male means you're destined for backbreaking labor, constant violence, and a lifespan that would shock you. Your childhood, if you can even call it that, ends before your voice changes. Your body becomes a tool for others to exploit, and your death, when it comes, will likely be painful, anonymous, and forgotten. Tonight, we're going to explore the brutal realities that awaited men in medieval society. From the moment they could walk to the day they died, medieval men faced challenges that would break most modern people within hours. We'll uncover why being born male in this era was often more curse than blessing, and how the romanticized image of medieval manhood is one of history's greatest myths. But first, let me give you some context about just how different life was back then. When we think of medieval times, we often imagine knights in shining armor, but the reality is that less than 1% of medieval men ever became knights. The vast majority were peasants, serfs, or laborers whose lives were defined by servitude and suffering. These weren't the heroes of legends. They were the forgotten masses who built the foundations of our world with their blood, sweat, and shortened lives. The statistics alone should give you pause. The average lifespan for a medieval man was somewhere between 25 and 35 years. Not because they aged faster, but because survival itself was a daily battle against forces completely beyond their control. Disease, violence, accidents, and starvation claimed lives with ruthless efficiency. And unlike medieval women, who at least had some protection within the household structure, men were expected to face these dangers head-on as a matter of honor and duty. What makes this even more tragic is how completely normalized this suffering was. Medieval society didn't see men's shortened lifespans and brutal working conditions as problems to be solved. They saw them as natural order, as God's will, as the price of being born male. The very qualities we associate with masculinity today, strength, courage, the willingness to sacrifice, were weaponized against medieval men to justify their exploitation. So tonight, we're going to strip away the romantic myths and look at what life was really like for the average medieval man. We'll explore how their bodies were broken by labor before they reached adulthood, how violence wasn't an occasional threat, but a daily reality, how the feudal system trapped them in cycles of poverty and servitude that lasted generations, and how the medieval church used concepts of masculine duty to justify suffering that would be considered torture by modern standards. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand why being born a man in medieval times was often a death sentence wrapped in expectations of honor and duty. You'll see how the very concept of medieval masculinity was designed to extract maximum value from male bodies while offering minimal protection or comfort in return. But let's start at the very beginning, with childhood, because that's where the brutal reality of medieval manhood first reveals itself. Medieval childhood, especially for boys, was nothing like the protected, nurturing environment we consider essential today. From the moment a boy could walk steadily, usually around age 2 or 3, he was expected to contribute to his family's survival. There was no concept of letting children be children. Survival was too precarious, resources too scarce, and life too short for such luxuries. By age 5, most boys were already working, not playing at work, but actually labouring in ways that would horrify modern child protection services. They hauled water, gathered firewood, tended animals, and helped with farming tasks that required small hands and backs that could crawl into tight spaces. The medieval world had no shortage of dangerous, backbreaking tasks that adults were happy to assign to children. But here's where being male made things significantly worse. While girls often worked alongside their mothers in relatively protected domestic environments, boys were sent out into the world much earlier. They worked in fields where they could be injured by farm tools or kicked by livestock. They were sent to tend animals in forests, where wolves and bandits posed real threats. They climbed into grain storage areas where they could suffocate or be buried alive. The mortality rate for young boys was staggering. Historians estimate that nearly half of all male children died before reaching age 10, not from exotic diseases or dramatic accidents, but from the accumulated wear and tear of a life that demanded adult responsibilities from child-sized bodies. A boy who fell into a well while drawing water, got trampled while herding cattle, or simply wore himself down with malnutrition and overwork was just another statistic in a world that produced such statistics regularly. And even if a boy survived these early years, his education in suffering was just beginning. Around age 7, if his family could afford it, he might be sent away to serve in another household. This wasn't summer camp or boarding school. This was indentured servitude dressed up as education. He would spend years as a servant, learning skills while being worked like a small adult and treated as disposable property. For peasant boys who stayed home, the situation wasn't much better. They watched their fathers age rapidly from backbreaking labour, saw older brothers succumb to accidents or violence, and learned that their own futures held nothing but more of the same. They weren't being prepared for careers or educated for advancement. They were being conditioned to accept a lifetime of physical suffering as the natural price of masculinity. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Medieval boys learned early that their value was measured entirely by their physical utility. They absorbed the lesson that pain was normal, that complaining was weakness, and that their bodies existed primarily to serve others. By the time they reached adolescence, they had been thoroughly programmed to accept exploitation as masculine duty. This is where the medieval concept of honour becomes truly insidious. Boys were taught that enduring suffering without complaint was honourable, that sacrificing their bodies for others was noble, and that any reluctance to embrace hardship was shameful cowardice. The very virtues that might have protected them, self-preservation, the desire for comfort, the instinct to avoid unnecessary pain, were reframed as vices to be overcome. By age 12 or 13, most boys had already experienced more physical hardship than many modern adults will face in their entire lives. They had scars from farm accidents, permanent injuries from lifting loads too heavy for their developing bodies, and the kind of premature aging that comes from constant physical stress. And they were still children, still growing, still needing protection and nurturing that their world simply refused to provide. But childhood was just the preparation phase. The real brutality began when they reached what medieval society considered adulthood, usually around age 14. That's when they truly learned what it meant to be a man in a world that had no use for weakness and no patience for those who couldn't keep up. The transition from boy to man in medieval times wasn't marked by ceremony or celebration. It was marked by a dramatic increase in physical demands and a complete elimination of whatever protections childhood might have offered. At 14, a medieval boy was expected to do a full man's work while still possessing a child's body and mind. For peasant boys, this meant joining their fathers in the fields for 12 to 14-hour workdays that would test the limits of human endurance. Medieval farming wasn't the pastoral lifestyle often depicted in romantic paintings. It was brutal, mechanized human labor that treated bodies like tools to be used until they broke. Picture this. Your alarm clock is the sun rising over frozen fields. You stumble from a straw mattress that you share with several family members, your joints already aching from yesterday's labor. Your breakfast, if you're lucky enough to have one, consists of bread so coarse it could sand wood and ale so weak it barely qualifies as liquid. Then you walk to fields where you'll spend the next dozen hours bent over, swinging heavy tools, lifting loads that strain your adolescent back and pushing your body beyond what it was designed to handle. The tools themselves were instruments of torture by modern standards, scythes and sickles that could easily cut off fingers or hands with one wrong move, plows that required multiple people to operate and could crush anyone who lost their footing, flails for threshing grain that regularly broke bones and caused head injuries. These weren't precision instruments designed with worker safety in mind. They were crude implements that got the job done regardless of the human cost. And the work never stopped. Spring meant ploughing fields with primitive tools that required enormous physical strength. Summer meant long days of cultivation under a brutal sun with no protection and minimal water breaks. Fall meant harvest time, when the entire community worked from dawn to dusk, racing against weather and spoilage. Winter, rather than being a time of rest, meant repairing tools, cutting firewood, and maintaining buildings while battling cold that could literally freeze you to death. The physical toll was immediate and devastating. Boys who had been relatively healthy at 14 were often permanently damaged by 16. Hernias from lifting heavy loads were common. Spinal injuries from constant bending and twisting were expected. Joint problems that would plague them for the rest of their shortened lives were considered normal parts of growing up male. But perhaps the most insidious aspect was how completely normalized this suffering became. These young men weren't seen as victims of an exploitative system. They were seen as fulfilling their natural role, doing what God intended men to do. Their pain was righteous. Their exhaustion was honorable. Their shortened lifespans were the price of masculinity, paid willingly by those strong enough to bear it. The psychological conditioning was as brutal as the physical demands. Young men learned that complaining about pain marked them as weak, that asking for help was shameful, that their worth as human beings was directly tied to their ability to endure whatever hardships were placed upon them. They internalized the belief that their bodies existed to serve others, that their comfort was irrelevant, and that their suffering was both inevitable and noble. This wasn't just about work either. This was about a complete worldview that saw male bodies as expendable resources to be consumed in service of community survival. When wars came, these young men would be the first sent to die. When dangerous tasks needed doing, they would be volunteered without consultation. When someone needed to take risks that might prove fatal, masculine honor demanded they step forward. The medieval world had created a perfect system for extracting maximum value from male bodies, while convincing those men that their exploitation was actually their greatest virtue. It was a system so effective that its victims defended it, passed it down to their sons, and died believing they had lived honorably even as they were ground to pieces by forces they never questioned. And this was just the beginning of their adult lives. The work that broke their bodies in adolescence was merely preparation for decades more of the same. Assuming long enough to experience they live decades, most wouldn't. The ones who survived their brutal adolescence entered what medieval society called full manhood, but what we might more accurately describe as a prolonged death sentence. By 18 or 20, these men had already lived through more physical lifetime. Their bodies bore the permanent marks of constant labour, poorly trauma than most modern people experience in a healed injuries, and nutritional deficiencies that would follow them to their graves. But the medieval world wasn't done with them yet. In fact, it was just getting started. Adult men in medieval times faced what historians call the triple burden of masculine expectation. They were simultaneously expected to be laborers who could outwork machines, warriors who could face death without flinching, and providers who could support families on resources that barely sustained one person. Failure in any of these roles wasn't just personal disappointment, it was social death. A loss of masculine identity that could destroy a man's standing in his community permanently. The labour demands alone were enough to crush most people. Medieval men worked in conditions that would violate every safety regulation ever written. They hauled stones for castle construction that weighed hundreds of pounds, often without proper lifting techniques or safety equipment. They worked in mines where cave-ins and toxic gases killed regularly and without warning. They operated machinery powered by water wheels and windmills that could easily tear off limbs or crush bodies. Take blacksmithing, for example. This wasn't the quaint craft portrayed in movies. Medieval blacksmiths worked in buildings filled with toxic smoke, handling molten metal with primitive tools, standing for 12 hours at a time next to forges that reached temperatures hot enough to cause severe burns from mere proximity. The constant hammering destroyed their hearing. The smoke damaged their lungs. The heat caused dehydration and exhaustion that could prove fatal during summer months. Or consider construction work. Medieval men built cathedrals and castles that still stand today, but they did it without cranes, without safety harnesses, without any of the protections we consider essential. They hauled massive stones up scaffolding that was barely more than wooden ladders tied together with rope. They worked at heights that would terrify modern construction workers, with no safety net except the hope that they wouldn't slip. When they fell, and they fell regularly, there was no emergency medical care waiting. There was just whatever crude treatment the local barber surgeon could provide, with unsterilised tools and no understanding of infection or internal injuries. The statistics from medieval construction projects read like casualty reports from military campaigns. Building a single cathedral might claim dozens of lives over the decades of construction. Men were crushed by falling stones, burned by lime mortar, poisoned by lead glazes, or simply worked to death by the relentless pace of construction. And these weren't considered tragedies. They were considered the natural cost of ambitious building projects, acceptable losses in service of greater glory. But perhaps nothing illustrates the expendability of medieval men like the concept of corvée labour. This was unpaid work that peasants owed to their lords, usually consisting of the most dangerous and difficult tasks imaginable. Men were required to drain swamps where disease-carrying insects swarmed in clouds thick enough to choke on. They cleared forests where wolves and bears posed constant threats. They built roads through terrain so treacherous that pack animals refused to traverse it. During corvée service, men were fed barely enough to keep them functional and housed in conditions that would be considered inhumane for livestock. They slept in the open during all weather, worked with infected wounds because there was no time for healing, and pushed their bodies beyond the point of collapse because stopping meant punishment or death. Many never returned home from corvée service, their bodies simply giving out under the accumulated stress of impossible demands. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical damage. Medieval men developed what we might recognize today as complex trauma responses. They learned to dissociate from physical pain because acknowledging it served no purpose. They became hypervigilant about perceived threats because danger was constant and unpredictable. They struggled with what we would now call survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when so many around them died from the same hazards they faced daily. And yet they were expected to show no weakness, express no fear, and maintain the stoic facade that medieval society demanded from its men. Crying was shameful. Admitting pain was cowardly. Seeking help was an admission of failure that could destroy a man's reputation and livelihood. The very emotions that might have helped them process their trauma were forbidden by the masculine code that governed their lives. This created a vicious cycle where traumatized men raised traumatized sons, passing down not just the expectation of suffering, but the belief that such suffering was noble and necessary. Each generation learned from the previous one that enduring pain without complaint was the highest masculine virtue, that sacrifice was always expected, and that their primary value lay in their willingness to be consumed by forces beyond their control. But the brutality of labour was only one aspect of the medieval masculine experience. Even more terrifying was the constant spectre of violence that hung over every man's life, like a sword suspended by the thinnest thread. Violence in medieval times wasn't an occasional interruption of peaceful life. It was the background noise against which all other activities played out. For men, it was both inevitable and expected. They were simultaneously victims of violence and perpetrators of it, caught in cycles of brutality that defined masculinity itself. The most obvious source of violence was warfare, which was nearly constant throughout the medieval period. Local lords fought each other over territory, resources, and perceived slights. Larger conflicts between kingdoms could drag on for decades. Religious crusades sent waves of men to die in foreign lands for causes they barely understood. And through it all, it was ordinary men, peasants and craftsmen with minimal training and crude equipment who provided the bulk of the cannon armies weren't fodder. Medieval professional forces with standardized equipment and tactical training. They were collections of desperate men armed with whatever weapons they could afford or steal, led by nobles who saw them as expendable resources. A peasant conscripted for military service might receive a rusty sword, a wooden shield, and a few days of basic training before being marched off to face enemies who were equally desperate and equally poorly prepared. The battles themselves were exercises in organized slaughter. Men fought hand-to-hand with weapons designed to cause maximum damage to human bodies. Swords that could sever limbs with a single blow. Maces that crushed skulls and shattered bones. Crossbow bolts that punched through armor and continued traveling through the bodies behind. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones lingered for days, with wounds that festered and infected, screaming for water or mercy that rarely came. But even surviving battle was no guarantee of safety. Wounded soldiers were often abandoned on battlefields, left to die of exposure, or be finished off by scavengers, human and otherwise. Those who made it home carried injuries that would plague them for the rest of their lives. Lost limbs, damaged organs, traumatic brain injuries that left them struggling with basic functions. Medieval society had no support systems for disabled veterans, no concept of rehabilitation or long-term care. A man who could no longer work became a burden on his family and community, often ending his days as a beggar. And this was just warfare between armies. Even more pervasive was the everyday violence that permeated medieval society. Men carried weapons as commonly as they carried tools, because the distinction between the two was often meaningless. A farming implement could become a weapon in seconds. A construction tool could be turned against fellow workers in moments of rage or desperation. Tavern fights weren't drunken scuffles that ended with bruised egos. They were brawls with knives and clubs that regularly resulted in permanent injuries or death. Property disputes weren't settled in courts, but through violence that could escalate into blood feuds lasting generations. Even religious festivals, supposedly celebrations of peace and community, often devolved into riots where men beat each other senseless over trivial disagreements. The legal system, such as it was, institutionalized violence as a method of settling disputes. Trial by combat wasn't a romantic notion from adventure stories. It was a legal procedure where men were expected to literally fight to the death to prove their innocence or guilt. The theory was that God would ensure the righteous party won. But the reality was that whoever was stronger, faster, or luckier would survive while the other died horribly in front of cheering crowds. Even within families, violence was normalized to a degree that would shock modern sensibilities. Fathers routinely beat sons as part of their education in masculinity. Brothers fought with weapons over inheritance rights. Extended family members settled grievances with fists and knives rather than words. The medieval household wasn't a refuge from violence, but another arena where men were expected to assert dominance through physical force. This constant exposure to violence created men who were simultaneously brutalized and brutalizing. They learned early that strength was the only currency that mattered, that showing mercy was often interpreted as weakness, and that the willingness to inflict pain was often the only thing standing between them and victimization by others. They became trapped in cycles of violence where each act of aggression seemed to justify the next, where revenge was not just acceptable, but morally required. The psychological impact of living in such a world was profound and lasting. Medieval men developed hypervigilance that never allowed them to truly relax. They slept with weapons within reach because attacks could come at any time. They interpreted neutral interactions as potential threats because distinguishing between friend and enemy could mean the difference between life and death. They learned to strike first and ask questions later because hesitation could be fatal. Yet even as violence shaped every aspect of their existence, medieval men were expected to embrace it as part of their masculine identity. Cowardice was the ultimate shame, worse than death itself. A man who avoided fights, who sought peaceful solutions to conflicts, who showed reluctance to shed blood, was considered less than fully male. The very instincts that might have helped them survive, caution, diplomacy, the desire to avoid unnecessary risks, were branded as feminine weaknesses to be overcome. This created a society where men were trapped between the violence that surrounded them and the violence that was expected from them. They couldn't escape it without losing their masculine identity, but embracing it meant perpetuating the cycles that would eventually destroy them and their sons. And still, we haven't even touched on what might have been the most insidious form of suffering that medieval men endured. The systematic destruction of their health through disease, malnutrition, and medical practices that were often more dangerous than the conditions they supposedly treated. Disease in medieval times wasn't just an unfortunate reality of life. It was a relentless predator that stalked men from cradle to grave, weakening them systematically until their bodies could no longer fight back. And the cruel irony was that being male in this era made you even more vulnerable to the diseases that swept through communities like invisible armies, leaving devastation in their wake. Medieval men faced what modern doctors would recognize as a perfect storm of health catastrophes. Their immune systems were already compromised by malnutrition and constant physical stress. Their living conditions were breeding grounds for every pathogen imaginable. And their work exposed them to toxins, injuries, and environmental hazards that would be illegal in any modern workplace. Let's start with the Black Death, the plague that killed between 1/3 and half of Europe's population in the 14th century. But here's what most people don't realize. Men died at significantly higher rates than women during plague outbreaks, not because the disease itself discriminated by gender, but because men's bodies were already so weakened by labor and violence that they had no reserves left to fight the infection. Picture a man in his 20s, already aged by a decade of back-breaking work, his body scarred from accidents, his nutrition consisting of whatever scraps his family could afford. When plague struck his village, his weakened immune system simply couldn't mount the kind of response that might have saved a healthier person. He would develop the characteristic buboes, the painful swellings that gave the disease its name, and within days he would be dead, often delirious with fever and pain. But the plague was just the most dramatic example of how disease ravaged medieval men. Far more insidious were the chronic conditions that slowly ground them down over years and decades. Respiratory diseases from working in dusty, smoky environments were virtually universal among craftsmen and labourers. Blacksmiths developed lung conditions from inhaling metal particles and toxic fumes. Miners suffered from what we now know as pneumoconiosis, their lungs literally turning to stone from breathing rock dust day after day. Parasitic infections were endemic. Every medieval man carried intestinal worms that competed with him for the nutrients in his already inadequate diet. These parasites didn't just cause discomfort, they caused severe anemia, weakened immune systems, and digestive problems that made it even harder to extract nutrition from poor quality food. Men would waste away gradually, their bodies consuming themselves as the parasites multiplied inside them. Skin diseases were equally prevalent and far more visible. Scabies, caused by microscopic mites burrowing under the skin, was so common that it was considered normal. Men would scratch themselves bloody trying to find relief from the constant itching, often causing secondary infections that could prove fatal. Leprosy, though less common, was a death sentence that began with small spots on the skin and ended with the gradual decay of fingers, toes, and facial features. Then, there were the occupational diseases that claimed men in specific trades. Stonemasons developed silicosis from breathing stone dust, their lungs gradually hardening until they could no longer draw breath. Dyers and tanners were poisoned by the chemicals they used in their work, developing cancers and organ failures that medieval medicine couldn't understand or treat. Soldiers suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but which medieval society dismissed as cowardice or spiritual weakness. The most tragic aspect of medieval disease was how it interacted with the social expectations placed on men. A man who showed signs of illness was expected to continue working until he literally collapsed. Admitting weakness, even in the face of obvious disease, was seen as shameful. Men worked through fevers that should have kept them bedridden. They ignored symptoms that modern doctors would recognize as medical emergencies. They pushed their diseased bodies past the point of recovery because stopping meant losing their masculine identity. This created a vicious cycle where diseases that might have been manageable with rest and proper care became fatal because men were culturally forbidden from seeking help. A respiratory infection that could be cured with a few days of rest became pneumonia because the sufferer continued working in cold, damp conditions. A minor wound became gangrenous because the man couldn't afford to stop working long enough for it to heal properly. Medieval medicine, such as it was, often made things worse rather than better. The theory of the four humours led to treatments that were not just ineffective but actively harmful. Men suffering from fevers were bled to reduce their hot humours, weakening them further when they most needed their strength. Those with digestive problems were purged with violent laxatives that dehydrated them and disrupted their body's natural healing processes. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia or understanding of infection control. A man with a broken bone might have it set by a barber surgeon using unsterilized tools, leading to infections that were often more dangerous than the original injury. Amputations were performed with saws and knives that had been used on multiple patients without cleaning, spreading disease from one victim to the next. The psychological impact of living with constant disease cannot be overstated. Medieval men lived in a state of perpetual anxiety about their health, knowing that any illness could be their last. They watched friends and family members waste away from diseases they couldn't understand or prevent. They developed a fatalistic attitude toward their own mortality that was both protective and tragic. Many men simply accepted that they would die young and diseased. They planned their lives around the assumption that they wouldn't see old age, that their bodies would fail them long before their time. This acceptance became a form of masculine stoicism that was celebrated by their society, even as it prevented them from taking steps that might have extended their lives. The diseases that plagued medieval men were often made worse by the very treatments that were supposed to help them. But even more devastating was the malnutrition that weakened their bodies from birth and made them vulnerable to every pathogen they encountered. Medieval nutrition wasn't just inadequate. It was a systematic starvation that began in infancy and continued throughout a man's shortened life. The food available to most medieval men was not only insufficient in quantity, but catastrophically poor in quality, lacking the essential nutrients needed for basic bodily functions, let alone the demands of heavy physical labour. The medieval diet for common men consisted primarily of bread made from whatever grains were available, often mixed with sawdust, bark, or other fillers to make it stretch further. This bread was frequently mouldy, sometimes toxic, and always lacking in the vitamins and minerals that human bodies require to function properly. When grain harvests failed, as they did regularly due to weather and warfare, men ate bread made from acorns, chestnuts, or even ground bones mixed with whatever plant matter they could scavenge. Protein was scarce and precious. Most medieval men ate meat only a few times per year, usually during religious festivals or after the slaughter of livestock that could no longer work. The rest of the time, they survived on thin gruel made from whatever vegetables they could grow or forage, supplemented by small amounts of cheese or eggs when available. This chronic protein deficiency meant their bodies couldn't repair the constant damage from heavy labor, couldn't maintain muscle mass, and couldn't produce the antibodies needed to fight off diseases. Vitamin deficiencies were universal and devastating. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, was endemic among men who couldn't afford fresh fruits or vegetables. Their teeth would loosen and fall out, their wounds wouldn't heal, and their joints would become painful and swollen. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency made it dangerous to work or travel after dark. Rickets from lack of vitamin D caused bone deformities that made physical labor even more painful and difficult. The most insidious aspect of medieval malnutrition was how it compounded over generations. Malnourished men produced children who were born already weakened by their father's poor nutrition. These children grew up stunted and sickly, becoming malnourished adults who passed the cycle on to their own offspring. Each generation was weaker than the last, less able to withstand the physical demands placed upon them. Seasonal variation made the problem even worse. During winter months, when fresh food was unavailable and preserved supplies ran low, men would slowly starve while continuing to perform the same physical labor. They would lose dangerous amounts of weight, their bodies consuming muscle tissue for energy. By spring, they were skeletal shadows of themselves, barely alive and completely vulnerable to disease. The psychological effects of chronic hunger were as devastating as the physical ones. Malnourished men became irritable, aggressive, and prone to violent outbursts as their blood sugar fluctuated wildly. They suffered from depression and anxiety that made it even harder to cope with the other stresses in their lives. Many developed obsessive behaviors around food, hoarding scraps or stealing from others in desperate attempts to satisfy their body's demands. Medieval society's response to this widespread malnutrition was to blame the men themselves. Hunger was seen as a character failing, a lack of proper work ethic or moral fiber. Men who complained about being underfed were labeled as lazy or greedy. Those who stole food to feed their families were branded as criminals deserving of harsh punishment. The system that created the malnutrition also punished its victims for suffering from it. Even when food was available, medieval men often couldn't properly digest it due to parasitic infections and digestive diseases. Their intestines were damaged by years of poor nutrition and contaminated water, making it difficult to absorb whatever nutrients their meager meals contained. They were trapped in a cycle where malnutrition made them sick, and sickness made the malnutrition worse. The irony was that medieval men were expected to perform physical labor that would challenge even well-fed modern athletes, while surviving on diets that wouldn't sustain a sedentary office worker today. They were building cathedrals and fighting wars while slowly starving to death. Their bodies were consuming themselves to fuel the work that their society demanded from them. This malnutrition also made medieval men more susceptible to the violence that surrounded them. Weakened by hunger, they couldn't fight effectively when attacked. Their reflexes were slower, their strength diminished, their ability to recover from injuries compromised. Many men who might have survived violent encounters if they had been properly nourished, instead died from wounds that their malnourished bodies couldn't heal. The most tragic aspect of medieval malnutrition was how it stole men's potential. We'll never know how many brilliant minds were dulled by hunger, how many strong bodies were weakened by poor nutrition, how many lives were cut short by preventable deficiencies. An entire civilization was running at a fraction of its human potential because it couldn't or wouldn't properly feed half its population. But perhaps even more devastating than the physical toll of malnutrition was how it combined with medieval medicine to create a perfect storm of suffering that would challenge even the strongest will to survive. Medieval medical treatment for men was often indistinguishable from torture. In a world where the causes of disease were completely misunderstood and the human body was seen as a collection of mysterious humours that needed to be balanced through violent intervention, seeking medical help was often more dangerous than enduring illness alone. The foundation of medieval medicine was the belief that all illness resulted from imbalances in the four bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This led to treatments that were not just ineffective, but actively harmful. Men suffering from any illness were routinely subjected to bloodletting, the practice of deliberately opening veins to drain what doctors believed was excess blood from the system. Imagine being a medieval man with a fever, already weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion. Instead of rest and fluids, you would be taken to a barber surgeon who would slice open your arm or apply leeches to drain away the very blood your body needed to fight the infection. Patients often died not from their original illness, but from the blood loss inflicted by their treatment. The cure was literally worse than the disease. Purging was another common treatment that subjected sick men to violent diarrhea and vomiting through powerful herbal concoctions. Men with digestive problems were given substances that made their conditions dramatically worse. Those suffering from dehydration were deliberately dehydrated further. The theory was that forcing these substances from the body would restore balance, but the practice often killed patients through severe fluid loss. Surgical procedures were exercises in agony that few men survived intact. Operations were performed without anesthesia, with patients held down by assistants while surgeons cut into their bodies with unsterilized instruments. The mortality rate for surgery was astronomical, not because the procedures themselves were necessarily fatal, but because infection almost inevitably followed. Men who survived the initial trauma of surgery often died days or weeks later as their wounds became infected and gangrenous. There was no understanding of the importance of cleanliness in medical procedures. The same instruments were used on multiple patients without cleaning. Surgeons operated with dirty hands and filthy aprons, unknowingly spreading disease from one victim to another. Trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in the skull to release evil spirits or rebalance humours, was a common treatment for headaches, mental illness, or head injuries. Men were held down while crude drills bored through their skulls into their brains. Most died immediately from the trauma, but those who survived often suffered permanent brain damage or infection that killed them more slowly. The treatment of wounds and injuries was equally barbaric. Burns were treated with boiling oil or red-hot irons, causing additional tissue damage that made healing impossible. Broken bones were set without proper alignment or support, leading to permanent deformities and chronic pain. Amputations were performed with saws and axes, often resulting in death from shock or blood loss. Perhaps most tragically, medieval medicine often targeted the very symptoms that indicated the body was trying to heal itself. Fever, which we now know helps the immune system fight infection, was seen as a dangerous excess of heat that needed to be eliminated through bloodletting and cooling treatments. Pain, which signals injury and encourages rest, was treated with procedures that often caused more damage than the original problem. The psychological trauma of medieval medical treatment was as severe as the physical damage. Men learned to fear doctors and avoid seeking help even when they were desperately ill. They would endure agonizing conditions rather than submit to treatments that were likely to kill them. This fear was entirely rational, given that medical intervention had a lower success rate than simply letting the body heal itself. The class system made medical suffering even worse for common men. The best doctors, if they could be called that, served the wealthy and powerful. Peasants and labourers were treated by barber surgeons, village-wise women, or travelling charlatans whose knowledge was limited and whose methods were often dangerous. Rich men might survive their medical treatment through sheer luck or better nutrition, but poor men almost never did. Religious beliefs also influenced medical treatment in ways that increased suffering. Illness was often seen as punishment for sin, so treatments included public confession, flagellation, and other forms of spiritual purification that added humiliation to physical agony. Men were told that their pain was God's will, and that accepting it without complaint was necessary for salvation. The irony was that medieval men often had better outcomes when they couldn't afford medical treatment. Those who were forced to rely on rest, simple remedies, and their body's natural healing processes were more likely to survive than those who could pay for professional medical intervention. The medicine of the time was so fundamentally misguided that it almost always made patients worse rather than better. This created a horrifying situation where seeking help for illness or injury was essentially a form of suicide. Men had to choose between enduring whatever was wrong with them and submitting to treatments that were likely to kill them in more unpleasant ways. Most chose to suffer in silence, which reinforced the medieval ideal of masculine stoicism while ensuring that treatable conditions became fatal ones. The combination of disease, malnutrition, violence, brutal labor, and harmful medical treatment created a perfect storm of suffering that defined the medieval masculine experience. But even this comprehensive catalogue of misery doesn't capture the full scope of what it meant to be born male in those times. Because underlying all of these physical hardships was a social and economic system designed to extract maximum value from men's bodies while offering them virtually nothing in return. The feudal system that governed medieval life wasn't just unfair to men. It was specifically designed to trap them in cycles of exploitation from which escape was virtually impossible. Unlike the romanticized version taught in history classes, medieval feudalism was essentially a protection racket where men traded their freedom, their labor, and ultimately their lives for the theoretical promise of security that rarely materialized. At the bottom of this pyramid were the serfs, men who were literally owned by the land they worked. They couldn't leave their lord's estate without permission. They couldn't marry without approval. They couldn't even die without their families paying a death tax to their overlord. These weren't free men choosing to work for wages. They were human property, bound to the soil like livestock, with about as many rights as the oxen they worked alongside. The obligations placed on serfs were crushing beyond modern comprehension. They owed their lord not just rent for the tiny plots of land they were allowed to farm for subsistence, but also corvée labour, unpaid work that could consume 3 or 4 days per week. During harvest time, they were required to work their lord's fields first, even if their own crops were rotting in the ground. They paid taxes on everything: milling grain, baking bread, brewing ale, even getting married or having children. But here's where the system became truly diabolical. Even free peasants, men who technically owned their own small plots of land, were trapped in webs of obligation that made their freedom largely theoretical. They owed military service to their lords, which could mean months or years away from their farms with no guarantee they would return alive. They were required to attend their lord's court, to provide labour for public works projects, to maintain roads and bridges without compensation. The economic mathematics of medieval life made independence impossible for most men. A peasant farmer might work 18-hour days during growing season and still not produce enough surplus to improve his situation. Bad weather, crop disease, or warfare could wipe out years of careful saving in a single season. And because most transactions were conducted through barter rather than money, men had no way to accumulate portable wealth that might allow them to escape their circumstances. The guild system, which controlled most crafts and trades, was equally restrictive. A man who wanted to become a blacksmith, carpenter, or baker had to serve years as an unpaid apprentice, then more years as a low-paid journeyman before he could even hope to become a master craftsman with his own shop. Most never made it that far. They remained trapped as employees their entire lives, subject to guild rules that controlled everything from the hours they worked to the prices they could charge. Even successful craftsmen found themselves bound by obligations that limited their freedom. Guild membership required regular contributions, participation in religious ceremonies, and adherence to production quotas that prevented innovation or efficiency improvements. A master craftsman who found a way to produce goods more quickly or cheaply wasn't rewarded for his ingenuity. He was punished for disrupting the established order. The church, which owned roughly 1/3 of all land in medieval Europe, was particularly exploitative of male labor. Monasteries operated as economic powerhouses, using the unpaid labor of monks and lay brothers to accumulate vast wealth while preaching the virtues of poverty. Men who joined religious orders thinking they were escaping worldly concerns often found themselves working harder than they ever had as laypeople, with the added burden of religious obligations that consumed what little free time remained. For men born into noble families, the situation was different, but not necessarily better. They were trapped in webs of feudal obligation that could cost them everything they owned. A vassal who failed to answer his lord's call to war could have his lands confiscated. A knight who couldn't afford to maintain his military equipment and horses could lose his status and be reduced to the level of a common soldier. The pressure to maintain appearances often drove noble families into debt that persisted across generations. The most insidious aspect of the feudal system was how it convinced men that their exploitation was natural and necessary. The church taught that social hierarchy was divinely ordained, that questioning one's place in society was tantamount to questioning God himself. Men were told that their suffering was temporary, that accepting their lot with humility would be rewarded in the afterlife. The promise of heavenly compensation for earthly misery kept millions of men docile in the face of systematic oppression. This psychological manipulation was reinforced by concepts of honor and duty that made resistance seem shameful. A man who complained about his working conditions was branded as lazy. One who tried to improve his circumstances through means other than backbreaking labor was considered greedy or ambitious in negative ways. The very qualities that might have helped men escape their situations, cunning, self-interest, the desire for a better life, were reframed as moral failings. The legal system provided no relief for exploited men. Courts were controlled by the same lords who benefited from the current system. Justice was expensive and slow, designed to favor those with wealth and power. A peasant who sued his lord faced not just the impossibility of winning, but also retaliation that could destroy his family. Most men learned early that seeking legal remedy for their grievances was more dangerous than simply enduring whatever injustices they faced. Economic mobility, the possibility that hard work might lead to improvement in one's circumstances, was almost non-existent. The medieval economy was essentially a zero-sum game where one person's advancement required another's decline. There were no expanding industries creating new opportunities, no frontier lands offering fresh starts, no technological innovations opening new career paths. Men were born into their social class and died in it, with their sons facing the same limitations. The result was a society where the vast majority of men lived lives of quiet desperation, trapped in circumstances they couldn't change, performing labor that enriched others while impoverishing themselves. They watched their bodies break down from overwork, their health deteriorate from malnutrition and disease, their spirits crushed by the relentless grind of daily survival, all while being told that their suffering was noble and their endurance was virtuous. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of medieval life for men was how the system convinced them to perpetuate their own oppression. Fathers taught sons to accept hardship without complaint, to find meaning in suffering, to take pride in their ability to endure what would break weaker men. Each generation passed down not just poverty and servitude, but the belief that these conditions were natural and unchangeable. This internalized oppression made medieval men complicit in their own exploitation. They didn't rebel because they believed rebellion was wrong. They didn't seek better conditions because they believed better conditions were beyond their reach. They didn't question the system because they believed the system was divinely sanctioned and therefore unquestionable. The psychological toll of living under such conditions was immense. but it was a toll that men were expected to bear in silence. The medieval masculine ideal demanded stoicism in the face of suffering, acceptance of whatever hardships life presented, and unwavering loyalty to the very system that was destroying them. Men who broke under the pressure were shamed as weaklings. Those who expressed anger or resentment were branded as dangerous malcontents who needed to be controlled or eliminated. And so medieval men lived and died in a world designed to consume them, a world that treated their bodies as resources to be exploited, their labor as commodities to be extracted, and their suffering as entertainment for gods who seemed to delight in human misery. They built the foundations of our modern world with their blood and sweat and shortened lives. Yet history remembers them primarily as statistics, as nameless masses who lived and died without leaving individual traces in the historical record. But their legacy lives on in ways both visible and hidden. The cathedrals they built still stand as testaments to human endurance and skill. The agricultural techniques they developed still feed the world. The social structures they created, even as those structures oppressed them, evolved into the systems that govern us today. Medieval men paid the price for civilization's advance, and that price was measured in lifespans cut short, bodies broken by labor, and spirits crushed by the weight of expectation that no human being should have to bear. The truly tragic irony of medieval masculine existence was how completely men were conditioned to see their suffering as virtue rather than exploitation. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of centuries of carefully constructed social programming designed to make men complicit in their own destruction. Medieval society created what we might recognize today as a cult of masculine sacrifice, where enduring pain without complaint wasn't just expected, it was celebrated as the highest form of manhood. Boys learned from their earliest memories that crying was shameful, that admitting weakness was disgraceful, that asking for help marked them as failures. By the time they reached adulthood, they had internalized these beliefs so completely that questioning them felt like questioning their own identity. The church played a central role in this psychological manipulation. Sunday sermons regularly praised the virtue of suffering, comparing earthly pain to Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Men were told that their hardships were tests of faith, that enduring them with grace would earn them eternal rewards. The more a man suffered without complaint, the more godly he was considered to be. This religious framework transformed exploitation into spiritual achievement, making men grateful for their own oppression. Folk tales and songs reinforced these messages through stories of heroic men who died nobly for causes beyond themselves. These weren't cautionary tales warning against unnecessary sacrifice. They were inspirational stories designed to make men aspire to similar fates. A peasant who worked himself to death supporting his family wasn't seen as a victim of an unjust system. He was held up as an example of masculine virtue that other men should strive to emulate. The concept of honor was weaponized against men in ways that made resistance psychologically impossible. Honor wasn't defined by personal achievement or individual happiness. It was defined by service to others, by willingness to sacrifice, by the ability to endure whatever hardships were imposed. A man who put his own welfare first was considered selfish and dishonorable. One who sought to escape his circumstances rather than accept them was branded as a coward and a traitor to his community. This created a psychological trap where the very emotions that might have motivated men to improve their situations, anger at injustice, frustration with limitations, desire for something better, were reframed as character flaws to be overcome. Men learned to suppress not just the expression of these feelings, but the feelings themselves, creating internal conflicts that manifested as depression, anxiety, and self-destructive behaviors. The isolation imposed by masculine ideals made these psychological burdens even heavier. Men were discouraged from forming the kind of emotional bonds with other men that might have provided support and perspective. Close friendships between men were viewed with suspicion, seen as potentially undermining their commitment to family and community obligations. Male bonding was acceptable only in contexts that reinforced masculine stereotypes: drinking together, fighting together, working together in silence. This emotional isolation meant that men had no safe spaces to process their trauma, no opportunities to share their fears and doubts with others who might understand. They carried their psychological burdens alone, developing coping mechanisms that often involved emotional numbing, alcohol abuse, or violence. The very support systems that might have helped them survive their circumstances were forbidden by the masculine code they were expected to uphold. The cumulative effect was a population of men who were simultaneously victims and enforcers of their own oppression. They policed each other's behavior, shaming any man who showed signs of weakness or rebellion. They taught their sons the same destructive lessons they had learned, perpetuating cycles of suffering that lasted for generations. They defended a system that was killing them because they had been convinced that defending it was their duty as men. Medieval women, while facing their own forms of oppression, were at least allowed to express vulnerability, to seek help when needed, to form supportive relationships with other women. Men were denied even these basic human needs, forced to present facades of strength even as they crumbled internally. The masculine ideal demanded not just physical toughness, but emotional invulnerability that no human being could actually achieve. The result was a form of psychological warfare waged against men by their own society, a systematic destruction of emotional resilience that made them more compliant and less likely to question their circumstances. Men who might have had the strength to resist their exploitation if they had been allowed to acknowledge their pain, instead channeled that energy into maintaining the stoic facades that their culture demanded. This psychological conditioning was so thorough that it persisted even in the face of obvious contradictions. Men watched their friends and family members die young from preventable causes, yet continued to believe that such deaths were natural and inevitable. They saw the wealth and comfort enjoyed by their social superiors, yet accepted that such luxuries were beyond their reach. They experienced the pain of watching their children begin the same cycles of exploitation they had endured, yet taught those children to embrace their suffering as noble duty. The most insidious aspect of this programming was how it made men complicit in oppressing other men. A peasant who managed to become an overseer didn't use his position to improve conditions for his workers. He used it to prove his worthiness to his superiors by extracting even more labor from those beneath him. A craftsman who achieved master status didn't reform the apprenticeship system that had exploited him. He perpetuated it, convincing himself that the hardships he imposed on younger men were character-building experiences rather than unnecessary cruelty. This horizontal oppression meant that men rarely united against the systems that oppressed them all. Instead, they competed against each other for the approval of their superiors, each trying to demonstrate his superior masculine virtue through greater endurance of hardship. The solidarity that might have allowed them to challenge their circumstances was fractured by competition and mutual surveillance that kept them isolated and powerless. The psychological damage inflicted by this system was as real and devastating as the physical harm caused by violence, disease, and malnutrition. Medieval men suffered from what we would now recognize as complex trauma, developing symptoms that included hypervigilance, emotional numbing, chronic anxiety, and an inability to form healthy relationships. But unlike modern trauma victims, they had no framework for understanding their suffering as anything other than personal weakness. The irony was that the very traits that made men valuable to medieval society, their physical strength, their willingness to take risks, their capacity for enduring hardship, were also the traits that made them vulnerable to exploitation. A system that needed strong men to fight its wars and build its monuments had every incentive to produce men who would sacrifice themselves without question. The masculine ideal wasn't designed to benefit men. It was designed to make them useful to others, even at the cost of their own lives and happiness. This systematic psychological conditioning helps explain why medieval men rarely rebelled against their circumstances, despite having every reason to do so. They weren't passive victims lacking the intelligence or courage to resist. They were active participants in their own oppression, convinced that their suffering served a greater purpose and that questioning that purpose would make them less than fully human. The tragedy of medieval masculinity wasn't just that men suffered and died young. It was that they were convinced to see their suffering and early death as achievements rather than tragedies, as proof of their worth rather than evidence of their victimization. They were taught to find meaning in meaningless pain, purpose in purposeless sacrifice, and honor in a system that treated them as disposable resources. This psychological framework was so effective that it outlasted the medieval period itself, influencing concepts of masculinity for centuries afterward. The idea that men should suffer in silence, that complaining about hardship is unmanly, that male pain doesn't matter as much as male utility, these beliefs didn't disappear with the end of feudalism. They evolved and adapted, finding new forms in each historical era, continuing to shape how societies treat men and how men treat themselves. Understanding this psychological dimension of medieval masculine experience helps us see that the physical hardships men endured were only part of a larger system of control designed to make them compliant with their own destruction. The real genius of medieval oppression wasn't just that it broke men's bodies. It was that it convinced them to break their own spirits, to see their exploitation as virtue, and to pass that poisonous gift onto the next generation of sons, who would suffer and die in turn, believing themselves honored to do so. Medieval men weren't just victims of circumstance. They were products of a system specifically designed to produce men who would accept victimization as their natural role, who would compete to demonstrate their worthiness through greater endurance of suffering, and who would never question whether such suffering was necessary or just. They were taught to measure their worth not by their happiness or fulfillment, but by their willingness to be consumed by forces beyond their control. And perhaps, most tragically of all, this system worked exactly as intended. Medieval men did build the cathedrals, fight the wars, and perform the labor that their society demanded. They did so without rebellion, without complaint, and often with genuine pride in their ability to endure what would have broken lesser men. They achieved everything their society asked of them, and in return they received shortened lives, broken bodies, and the hollow satisfaction of knowing they had fulfilled their duty as men. The cost of this achievement was measured not just in individual suffering, but in the loss of human potential that such suffering represented. We can never know how many medieval men might have become artists, scholars, inventors, or leaders if they had been allowed to pursue their own interests rather than serving the needs of others. We can never calculate how much human creativity and intelligence was wasted in fields and workshops and battlefields, consumed by a system that saw men as tools rather than human beings with inherent value. The legacy of medieval masculinity lives on today in ways both obvious and subtle, in the expectation that men should be stoic in the face of hardship, that male pain matters less than male productivity, that questioning masculine roles is somehow unmanly. Medieval men paid the price for building our world, but they also left us the psychological frameworks that continue to shape how we think about gender, sacrifice, and the value of human life. Their story isn't just a historical curiosity about a distant past. It's a warning about what happens when societies convince entire populations that their suffering serves a greater good, when they teach people to find meaning in meaningless pain and honor in systems designed to exploit them. The medieval period ended, but the lessons it teaches about the psychology of oppression and the power of social conditioning remain as relevant today as they were 7 centuries ago. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in comfort and safety that medieval men could never have imagined, remember that their sacrifice wasn't noble or necessary or divinely ordained. It was the result of systems designed to extract maximum value from human beings, while convincing them that their exploitation was their greatest virtue. Their suffering built our world, but it also teaches us that suffering without purpose isn't noble, it's simply tragic. And perhaps the greatest honor we can give to their memory is to ensure that no future generation of men has to pay such a price for the simple crime of being born male in a world that sees them only as resources to be consumed. And so, we reach the end of our journey through the grim realities of medieval manhood. A world where being born male was less a blessing than a burden, wrapped in the rhetoric of honor and duty. Tonight, we've stripped away the romantic fantasies of chivalrous knights and noble lords to reveal the truth that history often prefers to forget. The vast majority of medieval men lived lives of quiet desperation, their bodies broken by labor before they reached full adulthood, their spirits crushed by systems designed to extract every ounce of value from their flesh and bone. We've seen how boys became men, not through ceremony, but through exploitation. How violence wasn't an occasional interruption, but the constant background noise of existence. How disease and malnutrition systematically weakened generations of men who were expected to work until they dropped. Most tragically, we've witnessed how medieval society convinced these men that their suffering was virtue, their early deaths honorable sacrifice, their exploitation divine will. The cathedrals still standing across Europe weren't built by romantic craftsmen fulfilling artistic visions. They were constructed by men whose bodies were literally ground to powder in service of others' glory. The fields that fed medieval Europe weren't tended by pastoral farmers living in harmony with nature. They were worked by serfs whose shortened lives were the price of everyone else's survival. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story is how completely these men were taught to embrace their own destruction, to find meaning in meaningless suffering, to take pride in enduring what no human being should have to bear. They weren't just victims of their circumstances. They were products of a psychological conditioning so thorough that questioning it felt like questioning their own humanity. So tonight, as you settle into comfort that medieval men died dreaming of, remember that their legacy lives on not just in the stones they cut and the fields they ploughed, but in the lessons their suffering teaches us about the true cost of civilization and the price that societies extract from those they deem expendable. Sweet dreams.